There we go. Hey there, hi there, ho there. It's the 15th of July. Jesus, time flies. It's time for Dis and Dat information. Um, we're gonna try and see if we can read value, price, and profit. It gets occasionally mentioned. It's important. I think that to read it very carefully because it's something that was written in 1865, but it was edited and corrected. But the most important thing is that it's an English transcript, it's an English language lecture, and it's an English language lecture series delivered to the First International Working Men's Association, and not everyone has read it. And I hope that people will find it useful because it essentially compresses all the things that were sort of available when Capital Volume 1 was in preparation. So this kind of triangulates the our reading of Capital, which I'm going to return to. I sort of decided that we may move weekly marks to Saturday at 3 o'clock. So that's another change that we'll make starting this week, I guess. So what is it that we wanted to do? We're going to look at, we're just going to start reading it. It was published by Aveling, who is Marx's son-in-law. So it has that element as well. Citizens, before entering into the subject matter, allow me to make a few preliminary remarks. There reigns now on the continent a real epidemic of strikes and a general clamor for a rise of wages. The question will turn up at our Congress. You, as the head of the International Association, ought to have settled convictions upon this paramount question. For my own part, I considered it therefore my duty to enter fully into the matter, even at the peril of putting your patience to a severe test. I should say that every time I do these things. Another preliminary remark I have to make in regard to Citizen Weston. He has not only proposed to you, but has publicly defended in the interest of the working class, as he thinks, opinions he knows to be the most unpopular with the working class. Such an exhibition of moral courage for all of us must highly honor. I hope that despite the unvarnished style of my paper, at its conclusion, you will find me agreeing with what appears to me the just idea lying at the bottom of his theses, which, however, in their present form, I cannot but consider theoretically false and practically dangerous. I shall now at once proceed to the business before us. I would note, for those who haven't been paying attention, J.D. Vance is the Republican vice presidential nominee, and it shows that Trump was kowtowing to the venture capitalists who are supporting the Republican Party, because Vance was always the number one choice of those people. And Vance is the ultimate sycophant because only a couple of years ago, he described what Trump was trying to sell as douchey, and among other things, called him, America's Hitler. What else did he call him? A bunch of other things. And so that's going to haunt the campaign. Someone commented on Twitter that, they had the election in hand since the assassination attempt, and now they've gone ahead and lost the election again. So anyway, by choosing Vance. So I leave it to you to look up J.D. Vance. I put up a little note according to the thing I put up in Daily Coast to when it was announced, and it includes a list of things that J.D. Vance has said about Trump, and I hope that people will ask him. People will ask Trump questions about Vance, and vice versa, ask questions about Vance of Trump, about Trump. Okay, back to the 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 task at hand, production. We'll see how far we get today. Let's just put it this way. It's not a very long pamphlet, but it could take a while to read through it. And I don't intend on reading it all in one day. It's probably going to take us a couple of days. Production and wages. Citizen Weston's argument rested, in fact, upon two premises. Firstly, the amount of national production is a fixed thing, a constant quantity or magnitude, as the mathematicians would say. Secondly, that the amount of real wages, that is to say, of wages as measured by the quantity of the commodities they can buy, is a fixed amount, a constant magnitude. Now, his first assertion is evidently erroneous. Year after year, you'll find that the value and mass of production increase, that the productive powers of the national labor increase, and that the amount of money necessary to circulate this increasing production continuously changes. What is true at the end of the year, and for different years compared with each other, is true for every average day of the year. The amount or magnitude of national production changes continuously. It is not a constant, but a variable magnitude. And apart from changes in population, it must be so because of the continuous change in the accumulation of capital and the productive powers of labor. It is perfectly true that if a rise in the general rate of wages should take place today, that rise, whatever its ulterior effects might be, would by itself not immediately change the amount of production. It would, in the first instance, proceed from the existing state of things. But if before the rise of wages, the national production was variable and not fixed, it will continue to be variable and not fixed after the rise of wages. Now, but suppose the amount of national production to be constant instead of variable. Even then, what our friend Weston considers a logical conclusion would still remain a gratuitous assertion. If I have a given number, say 8, the absolute limits of this number do not prevent its parts from changing their relative limits. If profits were 6 and wages 2, wages might increase to 6 and profits decrease to 2, and still the total amount remain 8. The fixed amount of production would by no means prove the fixed amount of wages. How then does our friend Weston prove this fixity? By asserting it. But even conceding him his assertion, it would cut both ways. Well, he presses it only in one direction. If the amount of wages is a constant magnitude, then it can be neither increased nor diminished. If then in enforcing a temporary rise of wages, the working men act foolishly, the capitalists in enforcing a temporary fall of wages would act not less foolishly. Our friend Weston does not deny that under certain circumstances, the working men can enforce a rise of wages. But their amount being naturally fixed, there must follow a reaction. On the other hand, he knows also that the capitalists can enforce a fall of wages, and indeed continuously try to enforce it. According to the principle of the constancy of wages, a reaction ought to follow in this case, not less than in the former. The working men, therefore, reacting against the attempt at or the act of lowering wages would act rightly. They would therefore act rightly in enforcing a rise of wages, because every reaction against the lowering of wages is an action for raising wages. According to Citizen Weston's own principle of the constancy of wages, the working men ought therefore order, under certain circumstances, to combine and struggle for a rise in wages. If he denies this conclusion, he must give up the premise from which it flows. He must not say that the amount of wages is a constant quantity, but that although it cannot and must not rise, it can and must fall whenever capital pleases to lower it. If the capitalist pleases to feed you upon potatoes instead of upon meat, and upon oats instead of upon wheat, you must accept it, accept his will as a law of political economy and submit to it. If in one country the rate of wages is higher than in another, in the United States, for example, than in England, you must explain this difference in the rate of wages by a difference between the will of the American capitalist and the will of the English capitalist. a method which would certainly very much simplify not only the study of economic phenomena, but all other phenomena. But even then, we might ask why the will of the American capitalist differs from the will of the English capitalist. And to answer the question, you must go beyond the domain of will. A person may tell me that God wills one thing in France and another thing in England. If I summon him to answer this duality of will, he might have the brass to answer me that God's will to have one will in France and another will in England. But our friend Weston is certainly the last man to make an argument of such a complete negation of all reasoning. The will of the capitalist is certainly to take as much as possible. What we have to do is not to talk about his will, but to inquire into his power, the limits of that power, and the character of those limits. Number two, production, wages, and profits. The address Citizen Weston read to us might have been compressed into a nutshell. All his reasoning amounted to this: if the working class forces the capitalist class to pay 5 shillings instead of 4 shillings in the shape of money wages, the capitalist will return in the shape of commodities 4 shillings worth instead of 5 shillings worth. The working class would have to pay 5 shillings for what? Before the rise of wages, they bought, of course, with work shilling. But why is this the case? Why does the capitalist only return 4 shillings worth for 5 shillings? Because the amount of wages is fixed. But by why is it fixed at 4 shillings worth of commodities? Why not at 3 or 2 or any other sum? If the limit of the amount of wages is settled by an economical law, independent alike of the will of the capitalist and the will of the working man, the first thing Citizen Weston had to do was to state that law and prove it. He ought then, moreover, to have proved that the amount of wages actually paid at every given moment always corresponds directly to the necessary amount of wages and never deviates from it. If, on the other hand, the given limits of the amount of wages is founded on the mere will of the capitalist or the limits of his avarice, it is an arbitrary limit. There's nothing necessary in it. It may be changed by the will of the capitalist and may therefore be changed against his will. Citizen Weston illustrated his theory by telling you that a bowl contains a certain amount of soup to be eaten by a certain number of persons. An increase in the broadness of the spoons would produce no increase in the amount of soup. You must allow me to find this illustration rather spoony. It reminded me somewhat of the simile employed by Mencius Agrippa. When the Roman plebeians struck against the Roman patricians, the patrician Agrippa told them that the patrician belly fed the plebeian members of the body politic. Agrippa failed to show that when you feed the members of one man by filling the belly of another, Agrippa failed to show that you feed the members of one man by filling the belly of another. Citizen Weston, on his part, has forgotten that the bowl from which the workmen eat is filled with the whole produce of national labor, and that what prevents them from fetching more out of it is neither the narrowness of the bowl, nor not the scantiness of its contents, but only the smallness of their spoons. By what contrivance is the capitalist enabled to return 4 shillings worth for 5 shillings? By raising the price of the commodity he sells. Now, does a rise or more generally a change in the prices of commodities, do the prices of commodities themselves depend on the mere will of the capitalist, or are, on the contrary, certain circumstances wanted to give effect to that will? If not, the ups and downs, the incessant fluctuation of market prices become an insoluble riddle. As we suppose that no change whatever has taken place either in the productive powers of labor or in the amount of capital and labor employed, or in the value of the money wherein the value of products are estimated, but only a change in the rate of wages. How could that rise of wages affect the prices of commodity? Only by affecting the actual proportion between the demand for and the supply of these commodities. It's perfectly true. Considered as a whole, the working class spends and must spend its income upon necessaries. A general rise in the rate of wages would therefore produce a rise in the demand for and consequently in the market prices of necessaries. The capitalists who produce these necessaries would be compensated for the risen wages by the rising market prices of their commodities. But how would the other capitalists who do not produce necessaries? And you must not fancy them a small body if you consider that 2/3 of the national produce are consumed by 1/5 of the population. A member of the House of Commons stated it recently to be but 1/7 of the population. You will understand what an immense proportion of the national produce must be produced in the shape of luxuries or to be exchanged for luxuries, and what an immense amount of the necessaries themselves must be wasted upon flunkies, horses, cats, and so forth, a waste we know from experience to become always much limited with the rising price of necessaries. Well, what would be the position of those capitalists who do not produce necessaries? For the fall in the rate of profit consequent on the general rise of wages, they could not compensate themselves by a rise in the price of their commodities because the demand for those commodities would not have increased. Their income would have decreased, and from this decreased income, they would have had to pay more for the same amount of higher priced necessaries. But this would not be all. As their income had diminished, they would have less to spend upon luxuries, and therefore their mutual demand for the respective commodities would diminish. Consequent upon the diminished demand, the prices of the commodities would also fall. In these branches of industry, therefore, the rate of profit would fall, not only in simple proportion to the general rise in the rate of wages, but in the compound ratio of the general rise of wages, the rise in the price of necessaries, and the fall in the price of luxuries. What would be the consequence of this difference in the rates of profit for capitals employed in the different branches of industry? Why, the consequence that generally obtains whenever, from whatever reason, the average rate of profit comes to differ in different spheres of production. Capital and labor would be transferred from the less remunerative to the more remunerative branches, and this process of transfer would go on until the supply in the one department of industry would have risen proportionately to the increased demand and would have sunk in the other departments according to the decreased demand. This change affected the general rate of profit would again be equalized in the different branches. As the whole derangement originally arose from a mere change in the proportion of demand for and supply of different commodities, the cause ceasing, the effect would cease, and prices would return to their former level and equilibrium. Instead of being limited to some branches of industry, the fall in the rate of profit consequent upon the rise of wages would have become general. According to our supposition, there would have taken place no change in the productive powers of labor, nor in the aggregate amount of production, but that given amount of production would have changed its form. A greater part of the produce would exist in the shape of necessaries, a lesser part in the shape of luxuries, or what comes to the same, a lesser part would be exchanged for foreign luxuries and be consumed in its original form, or what comes again to the same, a greater part of the native produce would be exchanged for foreign necessaries instead of for luxuries. The general rise in the rate of wages would therefore, after temporary disturbance of market prices, only result in a general fall of the rate of profit without any permanent change in the prices of commodities. If I am told that in the previous argument I assume the whole surplus wages to be spent upon necessaries, I answer that I've made the supposition most advantageous to the opinion of Citizen Weston. If the surplus wages were spent upon articles formerly not entering into the consumption of the working men, the real increase of their purchasing power would need no proof. Being, however, only derived from an advance of wages, that increase of their purchasing power must exactly correspond to the decrease of the purchasing power of the capitalists. The aggregate demand for commodities would therefore not increase, but the constituent parts of that demand would change. The increasing demand on one side would be counterbalanced by the decreasing demand on the other side. Thus, the aggregate demand remaining stationary. No change whatever could take place in the market prices of commodities. You arrive, therefore, at the dilemma. Either the surplus wages are equally spent upon all articles of consumption, then the expansion of demand on the part of the working class must be compensated by the contraction of demand on the part of the capitalist class, where the surplus wages are only spent upon some articles whose market prices will temporarily rise. The consequent rise in the rate of profit in some and the consequent fall in the rate of profit in other branches of industry will produce a change in the distribution of capital and labor, going on until the supply is brought up to the increased demand in the one department of industry and brought down to the diminished demand in the other departments of industry. On the one supposition that there will occur no change in the prices of commodities. On the other supposition, after some fluctuation of market prices, the exchangeable values of commodities will subside to the former level. On both suppositions, the general rise in the rate of wages will ultimately result in nothing else but a general rise in the rate of profit. To stir up your powers of imagination, Citizen Weston requested you to think of the difficulties which a general rise of English agricultural wages from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would produce. Think, he exclaimed, of the immense rise in demand for necessaries and the consequent fearful rise in their prices. Now, all of you know that the average wages of the American agricultural labor amount to more than double that of the English agricultural labor, although the prices of agricultural produce are lower in the United States than in the United Kingdom. Although the general relations of capital and labor obtained in the United States the same as in England, and although the annual amount of production is much smaller in the United States than in England, why then does our friend ring this alarm bell? Simply to shift the real question before us. A sudden rise of wages from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would be a sudden rise in the amount of 100%. Now, we're not at all discussing the question of whether the general rate of wages could be suddenly increased by 100%. We have nothing at all to do with the magnitude of the rise, which in every practical instance must depend on and be suited to given circumstances. We only have to inquire how a general rise in the rate of wages, even if restricted to even 1%, will act. Dismissing friend Weston's fancy rise of 100%, I propose calling your attention to the real rise of wages that took place in Great Britain from 1849 to 1859. You're all aware of the 10 hours bill, or rather the 10 and a half hours bill introduced since 1848. This was one of the greatest economic changes we have witnessed. It was a sudden and compulsory rise of wages, not in some local trades, but in the leading industrial branches by which England sways the markets of the world. It was a rise of wages under circumstances singularly unpropitious. Dr. Ura, Professor Senior, and all the other official economical mouthpieces of the middle class, the aristocracy was the upper class of Great Britain, while the capitalists composed what was known to Marx as the middle class, proved, and I must say, upon much stronger grounds than those of our friend Weston, that it would sound the death knell of English industry. They proved that it would not only amounted to a simple rise of wages, but to a rise of wages initiated by and based upon a diminution of the quantity of labor employed. They asserted that the 12th hour you wanted to take from the capitalist was exactly the only hour from which he derived his profit. They threatened a decrease of accumulation, rise of prices, loss of markets, stinting of production, consequent reaction upon wages, ultimate ruin. In fact, they declared Maximilian Robespierre's maximum laws to be a small affair compared to it. And they were right in a certain sense. Well, what was the result? A rise in the money wages of the factory operatives, despite the curtailing of the working day, a great increase in the number of factory hands employed, a continuous fall in the prices of their products, a marvelous development in the productive powers of their labor, an unheard of progressive expansion of the market for their commodities. In Manchester, at the meeting in 1860 of the Society for the Advancement of Science, I myself heard Mr. Newman confess that he, Dr. Ura, Senior, and all other official propounders of economical science had been wrong, while the instinct of the people had been right. I mentioned Mr. W. Newman, not Professor Francis Newman, because he occupies an eminent position in economical science. It's the contributor to and editor of Mr. Thomas Tooke's History of Prices, that magnificent work which traces the history of prices from 1793 to 1856. If our friend Weston's fixed idea of a fixed amount of wages a fixed amount of production, a fixed degree of the productive power of labor, a fixed and permanent will of the capitalist, and all his other fixedness and finality were correct, Professor Senior's woeful forebodings would have been right. And Robert Owen, who already in 1816 proclaimed the general limitation of the working day, the first preparatory step to the emancipation of the working class, and actually in the teeth of the general prejudice, inaugurated it on his own hook in his cotton factory at New Lanark, would have been wrong in the very same period during which the introduction of the 10 Hours Bill and the rise of wages consequent upon it occurred. There took place in Great Britain for reasons which are beyond a place to enumerate here, a general rise in agricultural wages. Although it is not required for my immediate purpose, in order not to mislead you, I shall make some preliminary remarks. If a man got 2 shillings weekly wages and his wages rose to 4 shillings, the rate of wages would have risen by 100%. This would seem a very magnificent thing if expressed as a rise in the rate of wages. Although the actual amount of wages, 4 shillings weekly, would still remain a wretchedly small, a starvation pittance. You must not, therefore, allow yourselves to be carried away by the high-sounding percents in rate of wages. You must always ask, now, what was the original amount? And moreover, you'll understand that if there were 10 men receiving each 2 shillings per week, 5 men receiving each 5 shillings, and 5 men receiving 11 shillings weekly, I don't think you can expect his audience to have this kind of math skills. The 20 men together would receive 100 shillings or 5 pounds weekly. Then a rise, say, by 20% upon the aggregate sum of their weekly wages took place. That would be an advance from 5 pounds to 6 pounds. Taking the average, we might say that the general rate of wages had risen by 20%, although in fact, the wages of the 10 men had remained stationary. The wages of the one lot of 5 had risen from 5 to 6 shillings only, and the wages of the other lot of 5 from 55 shillings to 70 shillings. 1/2 of the men would not have improved at all their position. 1/4 would have improved it in an imperceptible degree, and only 1/4 would have bettered it really. Still reckoning by the average, the total amount of the wages of those 20 men would have increased by 25%. As far as the aggregate capital that employs them and the prices of the commodities they produced are concerned, it would be exactly the same as if all of them had equally shared in the average rise of wages. In the case of agricultural labor, the standard wages being very different in the different counties of England and Scotland, the rise affected them very unequally. Lastly, during the period that when the rise of wages took place, counteracting influences were at work, such as the new taxes consequent upon the Russian War, the extensive demolition of the dwelling houses of the agricultural laborers, and so forth. Having premised so much, I proceed to state that from 1849 to 1859, there took place a rise of about 40% in the average rate of the agricultural wages of Great Britain. I could give you ample details in the proof of my assertion, but for the present purpose, think it sufficient to refer you to the conscientious and critical paper read in 1860 by the late Mr. John C. Morton at the London Society of Arts on the forces used in agriculture. Mr. Morton gives the returns from bills and other authentic documents which he had collected from about 100 farmers residing in 12 Scotch and 35 English counties. According to our friend Weston's opinion, taken together with the simultaneous rise in the wages of the factory operatives, there ought to have occurred a tremendous rise in the wages of agricultural produce during the period 1849 to 59. But what is the fact? Despite the Russian War and the consecutive unfavorable harvests from 1854 to 56, the average price of wheat, which is the leading agricultural produce of England, fell from about 3 pounds per quarter for the years 1838 to 48 to about 2 pounds, 10 shillings per quarter for the years 1849 to 59. This constitutes a fall in the price of wheat of more than 16%. I'm sure you're keeping track of all this math. 16% simultaneously with an average rise of agricultural wages of 40%. During the same period, if we compare its end with its beginning, 1859 with 1849, there was a decrease of official pauperism from 1834 934,419 to 860,470. The difference being 73,949. A very small decrease, I grant, and which in the following years was again lost, but still a decrease. It might be said, subsequent upon the abolition of the corn laws, the import of foreign corn was more than doubled during the period from 1849 to 59 as compared with the previous period, 1838 to 48. And what of that? From Citizen Weston's standpoint, one would have expected that this sudden, immense, and continuously increasing demand upon foreign markets must have sent up the prices of agricultural produce there to a frightful height. The effect of increased demand remaining the same, whether it comes from without or from within. But what was the fact? Apart from some years of failing harvest, during all that period, the ruinous fall in the price of corn formed a standing theme of declamation in France. The Americans were again and again compelled to burn their surplus produce. And Russia, if we are to believe Mr. Urquhart, prompted the Civil War in the United States because her agricultural exports were crippled by the Yankee competition in the markets of Europe. Now, I know you're probably lost in all of this, and I probably will have to come back and explain all the underlying issues, but
right. Motherfucker from Ohio is the VP tape.
All these corn stuff. I'm almost to the end. Let me read it to the end, and I'll try and summarize this. Reduced to its abstract form, Citizen Weston's argument would come to this: every rise in demand occurs on the basis of a given amount of production. It can, therefore, never increase the supply of the articles demanded, but can only enhance their money prices. Now, the most common observation shows that an increased demand will, in some instances, leave the market prices of commodities altogether unchanged, and will, in other instances, cause a temporary rise of market prices, followed by an increase of supply, followed by a reduction of the prices to their original level, and in many cases, below their original level. Whether the rise of demand springs from surplus wages or from any other cause does not at all change the conditions of the problem. From Citizen Weston's standpoint, the general phenomenon was as difficult to explain as the phenomenon occurring under the exceptional circumstances of a rise in wages. His argument had therefore no peculiar bearing whatever upon the subject we treat. It only expressed the perplexity at accounting for the laws by which an increase of demand produces an increase of supply instead of an ultimate rise of market prices. So, in summary, what he's trying to say is that it is supply and demand, and the determination of prices is, you might be able to make estimates and you can do it in the abstract, but the reality is quite different. And there are other contingencies. And so tying wages to supply and demand and prices is very problematic. But some people want to do it because they want to be able to explain it to workers. Why am I increasing wages for, certain parts of the workforce, or how am I going to determine it? Well, maybe I'll determine it by number of hours worked or some other thing. But the whole point is that you have several different variables working at the same time, and you can't make a kind of generalization about wage rates should should top out at something or whatever. And in some ways, it's trying to get at the problem that it has yet to be solved, and that is, it would just be interesting if we knew if prices and wages were completely transparent. There would be immense change, I think, in the nature of how industry operates if that did occur. Anyway, he's going to go on and on about this. I don't know if it will serve our purpose to do it this. I will actually go hunt down a better summary of this, only because I think, just like I hate reading 19th century literature, the readings of the 19th century construction of English often doesn't make sense in 20th and 21st century terms. Essentially, where he moves along to is the question of what does a price system look like, and how, and it can't be really explained very simply, and it compares at least he does in the first part, the whole question of you might get impressed by the question of rates, but rates doesn't really tell you anything because they're different measures on different things. And so you may think, oh, well, the rates doubled, but the real wages or whatever, real demand and supply are actually very different numbers. So trying to seek to explain it by averages is one attempt to get this problem going. But the ultimate thing is you just sort of got to not give up on it, but use them only as sort of indicators rather than trying to determine a certain kind of fixed thing, whether it's a price or a wage. And this has to do with people not thinking about much. Marx is thinking about this, about well, what does this have to do with class standing, and what how poor are you, and in effect, what is your class standing in this context? So that's kind of what he's probing around with. And he's trying to advise the people that he's talking to is that, if you're going to negotiate or you're going to talk about these kinds of things, you have to be more smarter about what quantities are being used. And he's using some general history of price figures and a lot of things that it's garbage in, garbage out. There's some of these books on histories of prices assumes them to be kind of that it doesn't deal with the fact that prices, even if you were going to mark them all down, still had some relation to things like total revenue and a bunch of other things that would make the price less real. It's like when we talk about the consumer price index, for example, that that alters your relationship to the actual price and the worth of your wages, for example. You can be making X amount of dollars, but the reality is that, let's say in your profession, that while that appears to be great in, for example, one region, if you go to the next state over, which has a different tax structure, the thing that you thought was giving you a tremendous amount of income was actually very little. Have I lost everybody? I think that's clear from that. Let me stop to see whether this is a useful exercise.
I think so. Yeah, it's nice to hear Marx's words. I sort of. Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say again, I'm sort of miffed that he doesn't cut to the chase and say, this is doomed to failure, and along the way you're getting ripped off, at the start.
Well, I think a lot of it, I mean, if everyone could read spreadsheets and he had a little PowerPoint, maybe. I try to imagine Marx trying to do PowerPoint, trying to explain that.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really think of that, right?
Well, I mean, you're talking to, working people, and a lot of them are trade unionists, et cetera. Some of them are good at numbers, but not everybody is. And, just yammering about this might actually be too problematic. And some of them are not literate, so writing it up on a chalkboard might not make any sense either.
Did they have a Windows 1888? And was it arched?
Well, hopefully, he's picked a kind of straw man, this guy Weston. And Weston is an example of a kind of Ricardian view about how you think about, that is a very singular system, and that certain things seem to have a certain stability, but they aren't. They're much more complicated. Even then, they're complicated, because I would assume that the cost of living in certain parts of London are not as good as working in certain parts of Liverpool or whatever. Or working in the country in a smaller town. some of these wage rates are being yacked about at very, large numbers that, it's not, it seems convincing, but not convincing enough, I would assert. And some of the problems, of course, if you're talking to a working men's association, you're cutting across a whole variety of different types of working people. Some people are have different little craft levels, or they're machine operators, or whatever. There's all kinds of different things, and Marx is at that's what he's been trying to figure out, is how am I going to talk about all these things in a much more universal or generalized way, and can I talk about it in a way that will convince people that they're being ripped off, and and in a way that always shows that whatever result I get really does show that people are getting ripped off. So it is complicated, but it's not very complicated. If we could have just, like baby Hitler, we'd have brought an Excel spreadsheet to Marx in the middle of the 19th century.
We have Excel now, but we're still,
we still don't know how to use it. Yeah. We're still fucked. I have that problem trying to use the Google, version of it. Pain in the ass. Anyway. Well, that was probably as clear as mud. I'll think of something else better to try and approach this problem. I had hoped that by reading it that it would become clear, but then I discovered, as I usually do, that it's always hard to read Marx out loud, because it's even, I don't know, maybe it's easier in the 19th century to understand these sentences in English. I have no idea.
Well, I really enjoyed it. I pictured myself there for a moment, It was...
I see him going, well, this is kind of, and that's a stupid argument, and this is kind of how it works, and we're looking at averages, and the one point there about comparing rates was probably the most critical moment. It's to explain they're going to yak at you about rates, but you're going to get ripped off by this concept. It's like they should read, How to Lie with Statistics or something. You just bring that book. Yeah, instead of killing baby Hitler, you just take a book of how to lie with statistics back to the middle of the 19th century. Anyway, I'm about done. Are there any questions, problems? Oh, it was well received by the audience. I mean, this pamphlet, I think they made a fair number of them, and of course they published it more widely after Marx was dead. I think that they figured this is a lot easier for people to consume than having to read all of Capital, which is pretty obvious at the one hand. I mean, ultimately it gets to the point about the question of labor and attacking, the dogma that wages determine the price of commodities, expressed in its most abstract terms, comes to this, that value is determined by value. And this tautology means that, in fact, we know nothing at all about value. Accepting this premise, all reasoning about the general laws of political economy turns into mere twaddle. It was therefore the great merit of Ricardo that his work on the principles of political economy, published in 1817. He fundamentally destroyed the old popular and worn out fallacy that wages determine prices. That's the whole point of this thing. A fallacy which Adam Smith and his French predecessors had spurned in the really scientific parts of their researches, but which they reproduced in their more exoterical and vulgarizing chapters. So, it's trying to say, well, all this stuff is there, but it kind of supports the status quo. And it doesn't really get at working class issues. It tries to introduce this idea in a fairly clear term, or he sort of assumes what counts as this intermediate idea about commodities. And I'm sure the commodities is thought more generically. But anyway, yeah, Joe, I think you might as well cut it. I'm It's a fool's errand. It's more my fool's errands. Listen, at 7 o'clock there will be a reading group, as I recall. There's open dialogue at 8. We're having let's just go through this. The reading and writing workshop is at 7 o'clock. That's in about an hour. 8 o'clock there's an open dialogue. 9 o'clock it's game time hour with the game timers. And that's kind of what will be there for this evening. But if you've been paying attention, at somewhere around those times, there's going to be an interview with Lester Holt of President Biden. So that should be sort of interesting. There may, in fact, be something that happened other than J.D. Vance being selected as the vice presidential nominee, but I doubt it. In fact, well, if you really care about these matters, it's on C-SPAN. They're doing it gavel to gavel. So if you want every tedious moment, you can watch it. I assume it's a live stream somewhere, but I recommend no one do it unless you like laughing at funny dressed people in crazy versions of red, white, and blue.